What if the quiet old man everyone ignores, the one hunched over in the corner, is the one person you shouldn't have crossed? What if the stooped shoulders and slow gait are a carefully constructed lie, a retirement earned from a life so dangerous it had to be buried under decades of silence? For Clara Jenkins, a single mother scraping by on factory wages, Christmas Eve was about to answer that question. The snow fell in thick, silent flakes outside the Sterling Toy Company, blanketing the grimy industrial park in a deceptive layer of peace. Inside, the cheer was just as manufactured. Clara watched the hypnotic motion of the assembly line, her hands performing the familiar task of fitting plastic arms onto a line of identical dolls, her mind a million miles away. Her son, Noah, sat in a small, makeshift nook she'd created from cardboard boxes, humming a carol to himself as he sketched in a notepad with a worn crayon. He was 7, and the magic of Christmas still burned brightly in his eyes, a flame Clara fought desperately to protect from the harsh winds of their reality. Her boss, Richard Sterling, had promised a hefty Christmas Eve bonus for this skeleton crew shift, a promise as hollow as the plastic toys they were making. Sterling, a man who had inherited the factory but not an ounce of his father's character, saw his employees as interchangeable parts, especially the older ones. None more so than Arthur Pendelton, the night watchman. Arthur was a fixture of the factory, a man who seemed older than the brick building itself. He moved with a slow, deliberate shuffle, his back permanently curved into a question mark, his face a roadmap of wrinkles that spoke of a long, weary life. Most of the younger workers mocked him behind his back, calling him a relic, a ghost who haunted the corridors with his jingling keys and quiet cough. But Noah adored him. To him, Arthur wasn't a relic, he was a silent, gentle giant who always had a piece of hard candy in his pocket and knew the best hiding spots in the vast, shadowy warehouse. Clara saw it too. She saw the deep, knowing sadness in his pale blue eyes, the quiet dignity in the way he endured Sterling's casual cruelty. He was a man adrift in time, and on this Christmas Eve, his loneliness felt as palpable as the cold seeping through the windowpanes. As her shift neared its end, Clara saw him making his rounds, his silhouette a stooped, lonely figure against the glowing emergency lights. An impulse, born of her own struggles with loneliness and a deep-seated empathy, took hold. She poured a steaming cup of cocoa from her thermos and grabbed the extra sandwich she'd packed. "Arthur," she called softly, her voice barely a whisper in the cavernous room. He turned, his movement slow, a look of mild surprise on his face. "For you," she said, holding out the offering. "It's Christmas Eve. No one should be alone." He looked from the cup to her face, and for a fleeting moment, the weary sadness in his eyes was replaced by a flicker of something else, something ancient and powerful that vanished as quickly as it appeared. He took the cup, his gnarled, arthritic fingers brushing against hers. "Thank you, Clara," he said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "That's the kindest thing anyone's done for me in a long time." Noah ran over and hugged the old man's leg. "Merry Christmas, Mr. Artie." Arthur placed a hand on Noah's head, his touch surprisingly steady. "And to you, little man. To you and your mother." The simple, heartfelt moment of connection was a small beacon of warmth in the cold, impersonal factory. It was a fragile piece, however, and it was about to be shattered. The main office door flew open with a bang, and Richard Sterling stormed onto the factory floor, his face a mask of rage and panic. He was a man in a tailored suit who looked like he'd never done a day of hard labor, his youthful arrogance a stark contrast to Arthur's weathered patience. The warmth of the moment evaporated, replaced by the familiar chill of dread. Sterling's eyes, slick and predatory, scanned the factory floor, his anger searching for a target. "Jenkins. Is this what I pay you for? Handing out charity on company time?" he snarled, his voice echoing in the vast space. Clara flinched, pulling Noah behind her. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sterling. My shift was just ending." "It ends when I say it ends," he snapped, his gaze then falling on Arthur, who stood silently, holding the still steaming cup. Sterling's lip curled into a sneer of pure contempt. "And you, Pendleton? Still breathing? I'm amazed." You're a walking insurance liability. A fossil. Honestly, keeping you on is a charity project my father started, and it's one I intend to end. Don't bother coming in after New Year's. Arthur didn't react, his expression unreadable. He simply looked at Sterling, his gaze steady, holding a depth of stillness that seemed to unnerve the younger man. It was as if a mountain were being chided by a barking dog. This silent defiance only fueled Sterling's rage. What's the matter, old man? Cat got your tongue? Or did you just forget how to use it? He strode forward and, in a fit of pique, knocked the thermos from Arthur's hand. It clattered to the concrete floor, spilling the last of the hot cocoa in a dark, spreading stain. Noah gasped. Clara felt a surge of anger, but fear kept her silent. This was the man who signed her paychecks, the man who held the key to her and Noah's survival. Arthur slowly bent down, his joints creaking, and picked up the dented thermos. He looked at the brown stain on the floor, then back up at Sterling. He said nothing, but the silence was heavier than any shout. It was the silence of judgment, of a final line being crossed. Before Sterling could spew more venom, his phone buzzed violently in his pocket. He snatched it out, his face draining of color as he read the screen. The bluster and arrogance fell away, replaced by the raw, primal fear of a cornered animal. "They're coming," Sterling whispered, his voice trembling. "They're coming here." Now, Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. "Who's coming?" He ignored her, his eyes wide with terror as he stared at the main entrance. "I made a deal. A bad one. To stop a takeover. I thought I could outsmart them." He began pacing frantically, running his hands through his perfectly styled hair. "Lock the doors. Shut everything down." The factory's heavy metal shutters began to descend with a deafening groan, sealing them inside. The festive snowscape outside was replaced by impenetrable steel. They were trapped. A pair of headlights sliced through the darkness, followed by another, and another. 3 black sedans crunched to a halt on the gravel outside, their doors opening in unison. Figures emerged, silhouettes against the stark security lights, broad-shouldered men in long coats, moving with a predatory confidence that made the hair on Clara's arms stand on end. "Mr. Sterling, what did you do?" Clara cried, clutching Noah tightly. Sterling was hyperventilating, his back pressed against a support pillar. "They're not negotiators," he stammered. "They're enforcers. From a man you don't ever borrow from. He wants the factory, the patents, everything." He was a child who had played with fire and was now about to be consumed by the inferno. The men outside didn't bother with the main entrance. A heavy thud echoed from a side door, followed by the screech of tortured metal. They were coming in. Panic seized the room. Sterling was useless, paralyzed by his own foolishness. Clara's only thought was Noah. She had to protect him. But where could they go? The factory was a labyrinth, but these men would be methodical. It was then that she heard Arthur's voice, and it was a voice she had never heard before. It was calm, clear, and resonant with an authority that cut through the panic like a blade. The stoop in Arthur's shoulders was gone. He stood straighter, his head held high, the years seeming to melt away from his frame. The frail, shuffling old man had vanished, replaced by someone else entirely. "Clara," he said, his voice a low, commanding rumble that vibrated through the concrete floor. He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the door the intruders were assaulting. "Take your son. Go to the third aisle of the West Warehouse. Behind the unsold Jolly Jerry dolls from 1988, there's a loose panel in the wall. It leads to an old ventilation shaft. Stay there. Do not make a sound until I come for you." The instructions were so specific, so precise, it was chilling. This wasn't a suggestion, it was an order from a man who expected to be obeyed. Clara, seeing the absolute certainty in his eyes, didn't question it. She scooped Noah into her arms and ran, her heart pounding with a new kind of fear, one mingled with a bewildering sense of awe. Sterling, still frozen, could only stammer, "What, who are you?" Arthur finally turned his head, and the pale blue eyes that had always seemed so weary now glinted like chips of ice. "I'm the night watchman," he said, the corner of his mouth twitching in what might have been a smile, or a snarl. From his worn coat pocket, he pulled a small, smooth object. It was a king from an old, ivory chess set, yellowed with age. He rolled it between his thumb and forefinger, the motion fluid and practiced. It was not a nervous tick. It was a focusing ritual. The side door burst inward with a deafening crash. 3 men spilled into the factory, their leader a bull of a man with a scarred face and dead eyes. 2 more fanned out, securing the perimeter. They moved with the cold efficiency of wolves. The leader's eyes landed on the terrified Sterling. "Richard," he said, his voice a gravelly sneer. "My employer is disappointed. He feels you've violated the terms of your agreement." He took a step forward, cracking his knuckles. "We're here to collect the collateral." "In full," Sterling whimpered, sliding down the pillar. The enforcer chuckled, a cruel, ugly sound. "Don't worry. We'll be quick." He raised a heavy fist, but before he could move further, a voice spoke from the shadows. "That's far enough." It was Arthur. He stepped into the light, placing himself between the thugs and Sterling. The leader stopped, an expression of amused disbelief on his face. "Well, look what we have here. A hero." "Step aside, Grandpa, before you get hurt." Arthur didn't move. He simply stood there, rolling the small ivory king between his fingers. He looked the leader up and down, his gaze analytical, dismissive. "You're sloppy," Arthur stated, his voice calm. "You came in heavy, announced your presence a mile away. You didn't check the high ground, and your flank is exposed to 3 separate ambush points from the catwalks. Your boss, he must be getting desperate, sending amateurs." The leader's amusement curdled into anger. "You don't know who you're talking to, old man." "Oh, I think I do," Arthur replied, his voice dropping an octave. "You work for Cormac. He runs the docks now. Likes to think he's a player. But he's got no finesse. He's a blunt instrument. And you have the look of a Grafton Street boy. Cormac likes to recruit from the old neighborhood." The leader's face went rigid. The name of his home turf, spoken so casually by this ancient watchman, was like a bucket of ice water. "How do you know that?" he demanded, his voice tight. Arthur took a slow step forward. The factory lights glinted off the polished ivory of the chess piece. "Because I used to run Grafton Street," he said softly. "Before Cormac was even a punk stealing hubcaps. They had a name for me back then." He paused, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of the impossible hang in the air. He looked directly into the enforcer's eyes, and in that moment, the thug saw not a frail old man, but a legend he'd only ever heard of in hushed, fearful whispers. "They called me the Ghost." The enforcer's jaw went slack. The color drained from his face, replaced by a pasty, sickly white. The name was a specter from a bygone era, a boogeyman used to scare new recruits. The Ghost of Grafton Street. A master strategist who had controlled the city's entire underworld not with muscle, but with his mind. A man who could dismantle an entire criminal empire without ever firing a shot. A phantom who had vanished without a trace 30 years ago, presumed long dead. "No," the man whispered, taking an involuntary step back. "You're dead." "Reports of my death," Arthur said with a dry, mirthless smile, "have been greatly exaggerated." The other thugs, seeing the sheer terror on their leader's face, hesitated, their confidence shattered. They had come for a terrified suit in a toy factory. They had found a myth. Arthur stopped rolling the chess piece. "This factory is my board now," he declared, his voice echoing with decades of dormant command. "And you are all poorly placed pawns. Leave. Now. Tell Cormac that Arthur Pendelton says his expansion plans are cancelled. Tell him, his king is in check." The leader, trembling, could only nod. He and his men backed away slowly, their eyes locked on Arthur, as if he might dematerialize before their very eyes. They turned and fled into the night, piling into their cars and speeding away as if the devil himself were on their heels. The factory was suddenly, profoundly silent. The only sound was the hum of the machinery and Sterling's ragged, disbelieving breaths. He stared at Arthur, his mind struggling to reconcile the shuffling old janitor with the terrifyingly commanding figure standing before him. Arthur's posture softened slightly, the immense weight of his past settling back onto his shoulders, but the change was permanent. The illusion of frailty was broken forever. He walked over and picked up the dented thermos from the floor, a wistful look on his face. This simple life, this quietude, was a paradise he had built for himself, and tonight, it had been threatened. He turned his gaze toward the west warehouse, his expression softening. It was time to get his family. He found Clara and Noah huddled in the dusty ventilation shaft, Noah's face buried in his mother's coat. When Clara saw him, her eyes were wide with questions, with fear and a dawning, incredible understanding. "Are they gone?" she whispered. "They're gone," Arthur confirmed, his voice once again gentle, though the steel remained just beneath the surface. "It's over," he helped her out, and as they walked back onto the main floor, Sterling stumbled toward them, his face a mess of confusion and awe. What are you?" Sterling stammered out, the question that hung heavy in the air. Arthur sighed, a long, deep exhalation that seemed to carry the weight of 30 years of secrets. He looked at Clara, at the trust and concern in her eyes, and then at Noah, who was looking at him not with fear, but with an unwavering, innocent reverence. He owed them the truth. "A long time ago," Arthur began, his voice taking on a nostalgic, somber tone, "I was a very different man. I ran things. Not companies, not factories. I managed conflicts. I saw the world as a grand chessboard, and I was a good player." He explained how he had built an empire on strategy and reputation, a kingdom of shadows where his word was law. He was respected, feared, and untouchable. "But that life has a cost," he continued, his eyes distant. "It hollows you out. Then I met my wife, Eleanor. She saw the man I could be, not the man I was. She made me promise to leave it all behind. For her. For the family we wanted to have." He had orchestrated his own disappearance, faking his death and erasing every trace of Arthur Pendelton, the ghost. He became just Arthur, a husband, a father, and eventually, a widower. He took the job as a night watchman at the factory his wife had loved as a child because it was quiet. It was peaceful. It was penance. "I wanted to be invisible," he finished, his gaze returning to the present. "I wanted to live a small, quiet life. To watch over this place. It was my way of honoring her memory." The silence that followed was filled with the gravity of his confession. Sterling, the arrogant youth who had mocked this man, looked utterly broken and humbled. He saw now that he hadn't been employing a fossil, he had been in the presence of royalty in exile. I am so sorry," Sterling said, the words genuine, stripped of all artifice. "The way I treated you. I had no idea." "No," Arthur said, a hint of the old strategist in his tone. "You had no idea because that was the point. You saw what I wanted you to see." Sterling, desperate to make amends, to align himself with this newfound power, made an offer. "Work for me. Not as a watchman. As a consultant. A partner. I need you." Arthur gave a small, weary smile and shook his head. "My time as a king is over. I have no interest in returning to the board," but his eyes then fell on Clara and Noah, and a different kind of resolve settled in his expression. "However," he said, his voice firm, "things will be changing around here. Effective immediately, Clara is the new floor supervisor, with a salary that reflects that position. And you will personally fund a college trust for her son. You will also create a pension for me, a generous one. In return for this, and for your company's continued survival, we will all agree that tonight, nothing happened. It was just a quiet anything. Of course. Anything you say, as the first rays of Christmas morning began to filter through the high factory windows, casting long shadows across the floor, the three of them walked toward the newly opened doors. The air was crisp and cold, the world washed clean by the fresh snow. Noah, holding Arthur's hand on one side and his mother's on the other, looked up at the old man. "You were really brave, Mr. Artie." Arthur looked down at the boy, and his face broke into a genuine, warm smile. "Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is protect your family." He was no longer Arthur Pendelton, the lonely night watchman. He wasn't the ghost of Grafton Street either. He was something new, something more. He was a guardian. He had spent a lifetime mastering a game of kings and queens, only to find his true purpose in his final chapter, protecting a struggling mother and her child. As they stepped out into the bright, silent morning, it was clear that fate had not forgotten him. It had simply saved his most important move for last. So the next time you see a quiet old man, hunched and ignored, remember Arthur. You never truly know the battles they've fought, the kingdoms they've ruled, or the legends they've left behind.